The neighborhood had always been considered one of those picture-perfect communities, trimmed lawns, identical fences, and quiet streets where nothing ever seemed out of place. For years, the Homeowners Association prided itself on maintaining a strict image of order. No brightly painted houses, no driveway clutter, and certainly no commercial ventures. But beneath that polished surface, tension was always simmering. It all started with one homeowner, an ordinary resident who worked long hours running a modest food truck downtown. Day after day, the truck was parked miles away from home, serving up meals to hungry office workers and late-night customers. It was exhausting work, with long commutes, constant permits, and endless costs. At first, the truck was nothing more than a side hustle, but over time it became a livelihood. When the economy shifted and bills piled up, the owner saw no choice but to save money by bringing the food truck closer to home. Parking it in the driveway between shifts seemed harmless enough. After all, it was just a vehicle, even if larger than most. The truck never blocked anyone's path, and it was always cleaned after use. But in neighborhoods like this, it only takes one pair of watchful eyes to stir up chaos. That pair of eyes belonged to Karen. She was the self-proclaimed guardian of the HOA's rules, a woman who carried a binder of regulations thicker than any law book. For years, Karen made it her mission to patrol the streets, reporting the tiniest infractions, whether it was a trash bin left out a few hours too long, or a lawn growing half an inch above the approved length. But when she spotted the food truck parked in the driveway, her outrage reached new levels. Karen's complaints started small. A note slipped under the windshield wiper, warning that commercial vehicles were not permitted to be stored within the neighborhood. Then aimed the emails, CC'd to every board member of the HOA, demanding immediate action. The food truck, she claimed, was an eyesore, a disruption, a stain on the pristine image of the community. At first, the owner tried to ignore her, treating it as just another one of Karen's crusades. But the complaints multiplied. Karen began snapping photos from across the street, forwarding them to the HOA's compliance officer. She filed formal violations, citing obscure rules about maintaining aesthetic standards. The situation escalated to the point where the HOA scheduled a hearing to discuss the supposed violation. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Some residents didn't care, brushing it off as another one of Karen's petty battles. Others whispered that they secretly admired the food truck, wondering if it might someday serve meals closer to home. After all, not everyone wanted to drive downtown just to enjoy it. But no one dared say this too loudly, fearing Karen's wrath. When the hearing day arrived, Karen arrived early, binder in hand, rehearsing her case as though she were preparing for a courtroom trial. She listed off every possible violation she could find, her voice rising as she painted the food truck as a looming threat to property values. The owner, sitting quietly, could only listen as accusations piled on. The board members exchanged glances, clearly caught between upholding the rules and not wanting to appear unreasonable. The final decision shocked everyone. The HOA declared that the food truck could not be parked overnight in the driveway, citing commercial activity within a residential zone. But the ruling didn't stop there. They added that any operation of the truck within the neighborhood would be grounds for further fines and possible legal action. It was a devastating blow. The owner had tried to comply, had tried to keep things quiet, but Karen had forced the issue into the open. The HOA's ruling meant the truck could no longer return home at all, not even for restocking or cleaning. It was as if Karen wanted to erase every trace of it from the neighborhood entirely. Yet behind the frustration, a new idea began to form. If Karen wanted to push the truck out, maybe it was time to push back. But in a way no one saw coming. Instead of hiding the food truck, what if it became the very thing that brought the community together? The thought lingered long after the hearing ended. And when the next weekend arrived, something unexpected happened, something that would change the neighborhood forever. The weekend after the HOA ruling should have been quiet. Most residents expected the food truck to vanish, never to be seen again. Karen, especially, strutted around with an air of victory, telling anyone who would listen that she had saved the neighborhood from commercial corruption. But her celebration was short-lived, because on Saturday morning the sound of an engine rumbling echoed down the street. The food truck was back. At first, neighbors thought it was just stopping briefly, maybe unloading supplies before heading downtown. But instead of leaving, the truck parked neatly at the curb, right outside the owner's house. A few moments later, the smell of sizzling food drifted through the air. The aroma of grilled meats, fresh bread, and spices wrapped the entire street like an invisible invitation. Curtains were pulled back, doors cracked open, and one by one, curious faces appeared. The owner had made a bold decision. If the HOA wanted to claim the truck couldn't operate here, then it was time to test the boundaries. After all, the ruling had only banned overnight parking and commercial activity on private driveways. It had said nothing about operating on the public curbside, and that tiny loophole was all that was needed. By noon, a small line had formed. At first, it was just a couple of neighbors, people who had quietly admired the truck before, but never spoken up. Then it grew. Word spread quickly, not just through the neighborhood, but through nearby communities. Families arrived, kids tugging at their parents' hands, eager for a taste. The quiet residential street suddenly felt alive, buzzing with chatter and laughter. Karen was horrified. From her porch, she watched as car after car pulled up, as people gathered in cheerful clusters, eating meals on the sidewalk. What she had imagined as an eyesore was now a hub of joy, and worst of all, everyone seemed to love it. Property values weren't dropping. They were thriving, as people marveled at how lucky the residents were to have gourmet food just steps from their doors. The HOA board members were caught off guard. Some tried to act as though nothing was happening, reluctant to confront the growing crowd. Others seemed to quietly enjoy the food themselves, sneaking plates back to their homes. The situation had spun out of Karen's control, and for the first time, her complaints weren't being taken as seriously. Still, Karen refused to give up. She marched across the street, binder in hand, demanding that the truck shut down immediately. But the response from the crowd was not what she expected. Neighbors who had once tolerated her antics now stood their ground. They pointed out that the truck was parked legally on public property, operating within city ordinances. Some even argued that it brought a sense of community that had been missing for years. The tension was thick, but Karen's protests were drowned out by the laughter, the clinking of food containers, and the sizzling from the grill. The food truck had become more than just a business. It was an event. That night, as the truck finally packed up and drove off, Karen was left seething on her porch, vowing that this was far from over. She began planning her next move, one that would drag the HOA deeper into the conflict. But while she schemed in silence, the rest of the neighborhood couldn't stop, talking about how incredible the day had been. The owner, meanwhile, realized something profound. The food truck didn't just belong downtown anymore. It belonged here, among neighbors, friends, and families who had never felt so connected. What had started as a desperate workaround was turning into a revolution. By the time the next weekend rolled around, the anticipation was electric. People were already planning their visits, spreading the word to coworkers, relatives, and friends. The neighborhood that once felt stiff and restricted was becoming the center of something new, something vibrant. Karen had wanted to erase the food truck from existence. Instead, she had created the spark that turned it into the neighborhood's most celebrated attraction. And as the crowds grew larger, so did the stakes. Karen wasn't done fighting, and the HOA was about to be dragged into a battle it never expected. The second weekend of the food truck brought even bigger crowds than the first. Cars lined the streets, children ran across lawns with plates of food in hand, and neighbors who had barely spoken to one another before now laughed together in folding chairs. What was once a quiet, rigid community had turned into something lively and warm. But not everyone was celebrating. Behind closed doors, the HOA board convened in a special meeting. Karen had stormed into the office the morning after the first weekend, binder clutched tightly, demanding immediate enforcement. She insisted that the food truck was a violation of everything the HOA stood for. She claimed it was a safety hazard, an eyesore, a source of traffic congestion. She spoke with the same determination as before, except this time she had photographs, timestamps, and even written complaints from a few residents she had pressured into signing her petitions. The board members sat around the table, papers spread out before hem. Some were hesitant to act, aware of how popular the food truck had already become. Others worried that if they ignored Karen, they'd open the door for other residents to test the limits of the rules. The HOA had built its reputation on strict enforcement, and if they didn't take action now, they feared losing control entirely. Within days, official letters were drafted. The food truck owner received a notice citing nuisance activity and unapproved use of community space. The letter demanded that all operations within the neighborhood cease immediately, warning of escalating fines and potential legal measures if the orders were ignored. But the letters didn't have the effect the HOA intended. Instead of scaring the food truck away, they rallied the neighborhood even further. Residents began openly defending the truck, arguing that the HOA was overstepping its authority. Some pointed out that the curb was public property, not subject to HOA control. Others accused Karen of having a personal vendetta, using the board as her weapon.
This is an outrage!
The standoff
You can't just
deepened.
park here!
On the third weekend, the food truck returned as usual. This time, the turnout was even larger, with people traveling from outside neighborhoods just to see what all the fuss was about. Lawn chairs, picnic blankets, and even small speakers appeared as the street transformed into a block party. For every letter the HOA delivered, the community seemed to double its support. Karen, however, refused to be outshined. She spent her evenings drafting more complaints, contacting city officials, and digging through zoning codes for anything she could use. Her mission was no longer about property values. It was personal. She believed the truck was defying her authority, mocking her persistence and undermining the order she had spent years protecting. By the middle of the month, the HOA escalated its tactics. They sent private security patrols through the neighborhood, photographing the gatherings and warning visitors that they were trespassing. They issued new violation letters, this time threatening to place liens on the food truck owner's property. They even tried to have police intervene, though officers found no legal basis to shut down a business operating within city guidelines. The harder the HOA pushed, the more resistance they faced. Neighbors began hosting potlucks alongside the food truck, using it as a rallying point. The gatherings weren't just about food anymore. They were about reclaiming their community from an HOA that many now saw as oppressive. Karen's once intimidating presence had lost its power, as her constant shouting and threats were drowned out by laughter, music, and the sound of sizzling food. Yet the battle was far from over. The HOA had deeper pockets and more resources than any single homeowner. Behind closed doors, they began discussing legal action, filing lawsuits, pursuing city council meetings, and lobbying for ordinances that could shut down the food truck permanently. And while the community seemed stronger than ever, the food truck owner knew the fight was just beginning. What had started as a personal dispute with Karen had now turned into a war with the entire HOA. As the third weekend drew to a close and the truck packed up for the night, the neighborhood buzzed with excitement, but an undercurrent of unease remained. Everyone could sense that the HOA was planning something bigger, something that could threaten not just the food truck, but the unity the community had only just discovered. Karen, standing at her window, watched the truck's taillights disappear into the night. She smiled coldly to herself, convinced that the board's next move would finally crush her opponent. But she didn't realize that the very pressure she applied was only making the food truck stronger. The community wasn't ready to back down, and the real battle was about to begin. By the fourth weekend, the neighborhood no longer resembled the carefully controlled community that the HOA had once prided itself on. What began as a small gathering around a single food truck had transformed into a weekly tradition, something everyone looked forward to. Families pulled out folding tables, kids rode bikes between the parked cars, and neighbors who once kept their distance now mingled like old friends. The smell of food, the sound of laughter, and the energy of togetherness filled the air. But while the residents thrived, the HOA grew restless. They had already issued fines, mailed threats, and even attempted legal intimidation. Yet the food truck returned every weekend, stronger than before. Karen's frustration grew by the day. She stalked the sidewalks with her binder, scribbling notes and snapping pictures, convinced that every detail would be the evidence needed to finally end the food truck craze. Still, Karen underestimated one thing: the unity of the community. The HOA's heavy-handed tactics had backfired. Instead of isolating the food truck owner, they had driven the neighbors together into open defiance. People began openly challenging the board at meetings, demanding to know why harmless gatherings were treated like crimes. Some residents even formed a grassroots committee, determined to protect the food truck and keep the HOA in check. The committee organized petitions, quickly gathering signatures from nearly every household. They drafted letters to city officials, arguing that the food truck was not a nuisance but a benefit, boosting community spirit and even attracting positive attention to the area. Local news outlets began to take notice, showing up with cameras to capture footage of families enjoying meals in defiance of HOA rules. The publicity shifted the narrative. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about one resident's food truck, it was as about a neighborhood standing up against overreach. People from nearby communities came to support the gatherings, turning them into events that felt more like festivals than block parties. Vendors began asking if they could join in, offering baked goods, crafts, and live music. What had once been a quiet suburb was now a hub of activity. Children who had never known their neighbors before now played together for hours. Adults who had once rushed from work to shut themselves inside now lingered outside, sharing food and stories. For many, it felt like the neighborhood had finally come alive. Karen, of course, despised it. She complained louder than ever, insisting that property values were plummeting, even as realtors noted the opposite. Houses in the area suddenly seemed more attractive, marketed as part of a vibrant social community. But facts didn't matter to Karen. What mattered was control, and she felt it slipping through her fingers. In retaliation, the HOA escalated further. They sent cease and desist letters, warning of lawsuits and threatening to revoke community privileges like pool and clubhouse access. They attempted to fine homeowners who attended the gatherings, claiming they were aiding in violations. The tactics were aggressive, even desperate, but the neighborhood didn't bend. Instead, the resistance grew. When the HOA tried to block access to the clubhouse as punishment, residents held a bigger event outside, drawing even more people. When fines were mailed, neighbors pooled funds to pay them off collectively, treating it as a badge of honor rather than a penalty. The HOA had underestimated the power of solidarity, and every move they made seemed only to deepen the resolve of those they opposed. The food truck, once just a livelihood for its owner, had become a symbol. It represented freedom from micromanagement, community over isolation, and joy over control. The more the HOA fought, the more people rallied around it. Yet beneath the celebration, there was still tea and seeing. Everyone knew the HOA had resources and connections that the community could not ignore forever. Legal battles were expensive, and while spirits were high, the threat of financial ruin loomed in the background. But for now, the residents weren't thinking about the long-term fight. They were living in the moment, enjoying the unity they had discovered, and refusing to bow to intimidation. Each weekend felt like a victory, a reminder that even in the face of relentless opposition, people could take back their neighborhood and make it their own. And as the fourth weekend closed with laughter echoing through the streets, the community sensed something big was coming. The HOA wasn't done, and neither was Karen. The next move would be decisive. and no one knew whether it would bring the neighborhood closer together or tear it apart. By the fifth weekend, the neighborhood gatherings had become legendary. What began as one food truck on a quiet street had exploded into a weekly spectacle, with lawn chairs lining the sidewalks and cars spilling onto nearby roads. Children darted between clusters of adults, music played softly from portable speakers, and the air buzzed with the smells of food that carried far beyond the community gates. But beneath the joy, tension thickened. The HOA was losing its grip, and Karen could feel her authority slipping away. For years, she had been the loudest voice, the enforcer of rules, the one who kept the community in line. Now, she was mocked openly, her binder of violations dismissed as nothing more than background noise. The more she demanded obedience, the less anyone listened. Karen knew she had one final card to play. If she couldn't crush the food truck through the HOA's rules, she would escalate to the city itself. She began compiling every shred of evidence she could muster, photographs of crowded streets, videos of cars parked along curbs, and written statements she pressured a few reluctant neighbors into signing. She claimed the gatherings were dangerous, that emergency vehicles couldn't pass, that noise levels were unbearable, and that public safety was at risk. She filed formal complaints with zoning boards, public safety committees, and even local law enforcement. Karen made phone calls late into the night, demanding that officials do their jobs and shut down the food truck once and for all. The neighborhood sensed the storm coming. Flyers began circulating, warning residents that the city council would soon be reviewing complaints about the gatherings. The community committee, now organized and focused, prepared their defense. They collected testimonials, gathered data on property values, and invited media outlets to cover the positive impact the food truck had created. The night of the council hearing was tense. Residents filled the chamber, lining the walls with posters and shirts showing their support. Karen sat in the front row, binder stacked high, confident that this would be her final victory. When it was her turn to speak, she launched into her argument with fiery passion, painting a picture of chaos and disorder. She claimed the truck was destroying the peace, lowering values, and threatening the very fabric of the neighborhood. But when it was time for the community to respond, the atmosphere shifted. One by one, residents stood and spoke. Parents who shared how the gatherings gave their children a safe place to play, elderly neighbors who felt less isolated thanks to the events, and families who credited the food truck with creating friendships where there had once been silence. Even local business owners testified, explaining how the gatherings had boosted their visibility and encouraged small commerce. The council listened carefully, weighing both sides. Karen's voice, once the loudest in the neighborhood, was now drowned out by the sheer volume of support for the food truck. The narrative had changed. What she saw as disorder, the community saw as life. What she labeled a nuisance, they cherished as belonging. When the ruling came down, it was decisive. The council declared that the food truck was operating within legal limits and posed no threat to safety. In fact, they praised the community for fostering unity and even hinted at plans to create designated spaces for gatherings like these across the city. Karen was livid. She stormed out of the chamber, binder clutched to her chest, her face flushed with fury. This was supposed to be her triumph, her final strike against the food truck. Instead, she had handed the neighborhood its biggest victory yet. Back in the community, the celebration was immediate. Residents gathered that very weekend, larger than ever before, to mark the moment. Music was louder, the food tastier, and the laughter unstoppable. For the first time, the HOA board was absent. Some members had quietly resigned, unwilling to continue a fight they could no longer justify. Others simply stayed home, recognizing that the tide had turned against them. Karen, however, was not done entirely. Though she had lost in the council chambers, she vowed that she would never accept defeat. She would keep her binder close, watching, waiting, hoping for any missteps she could exploit. But the neighborhood no longer feared her. They had stood together, faced her wrath, and prevailed. Karen's last stand had backfired, and the balance of power had shifted permanently. Still, as the crowd cheered and the food truck owner served another plate with a smile, everyone knew the battle had left scars. The HOA had not been dismantled, only weakened, and Karen still lingered like a storm on the horizon. The final chapter of this saga was yet to be written, and it would decide whether the neighborhood's victory was permanent or only temporary. The council ruling changed everything. For the first time, the food truck was not just tolerated, it was validated. The official stamp of approval removed the last shred of doubt for the residents. The gatherings were no longer acts of quiet rebellion. They were now celebrated events, proudly embraced as part of the neighborhood's identity. The following weekends were unlike anything the community had ever seen. The crowd doubled, then tripled, as news coverage spread the story of the neighborhood that stood up to its HOA and won. Cars arrived from other towns, and people treated the food truck as a landmark, a place worth visiting. What had started as one homeowner's desperate attempt to save money had transformed into a thriving cultural hub. Vendors joined in, local musicians brought their guitars, bakers sold their goods from fold-out tables, and kids ran lemonade stands beside the truck. What had once been a street defined by silence and manicured perfection was now alive with music, laughter, and the aroma of food drifting into the night sky. The residents themselves had changed. For years, they had lived side by side but rarely connected. Now, friendships had formed across fences, block parties extended into weeknights, and neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now shared meals together. The community had grown closer, stronger, and far more resilient than the HOA had ever intended. For the food truck owner, it was more than just a business success. It was redemption. What began as a battle to defend a livelihood had become the catalyst for transforming the neighborhood. The truck no longer symbolized defiance, but rather unity, independence, and the joy of reclaiming life from overregulation. Karen, however, remained a shadow on the edge of it all. She still patrolled with her binder, scribbling notes and muttering about violations, but her words no longer carried weight. Neighbors who once feared her now waved her off with a smile, or worse, ignored her completely. Without the HOA's backing, her authority evaporated. What she saw as chaos, everyone else saw as community. The HOA itself was fractured. Some members resigned, others quietly admitted they had been wrong, and a few even joined the gatherings themselves. The rules that once kept the neighborhood rigid and cold were now under review, with residents demanding more freedom, more flexibility, and less intrusion. The age of strict conformity was over. And so, the neighborhood entered a new era. Where once there had been fear of fines and violations, there was now laughter, music, and shared meals. The food truck had not only survived, it had become the heart of the community, something Karen had tried so desperately to destroy, but had instead cemented into legend. Looking back, it was ironic. Karen's relentless campaign to erase the food truck had been the very thing that gave it power. Her complaints had drawn attention, her petitions had fueled resistance, and her stubbornness had forged unity. Without her, the gatherings might never have happened at all. As the sun set on yet another weekend, and the truck's lights glowed against the evening sky, the residents reflected on how far they had come. What was once a neighborhood ruled by fear had become a place defined by connection. The HOA had tried to shut them down, but instead it had created something bigger than rules could ever contain. And while Karen still watched from her window, binder clutched tightly, the neighborhood moved on without her. They were no longer bound by her complaints or her control. They had built something stronger, something permanent. The food truck stayed, the gatherings grew, and the neighborhood was never the same again.